As a leader in an engineering organization, I think one of the most impactful skills that you can develop is effectively communicating externally, being able to really synthesize and understand the relative difficulty of implementation paths within your product and communicate that to someone who is sitting at the other end of the table is a bit of a superpower. I think it's pretty hard to always do unless you really do have that kind of deeper in the weeds understanding of what's happening within the code base.
Something we wanted to discuss with you today was your role of CTO and how you stepped into that position where you are at Column today. Could you just share a little bit about some of the challenges that you have faced along the way stepping into that position?
So my kind of path here was going to college thinking I was going to do something in the technical world. I thought maybe math or physics, but immediately falling in love with computer science, dropping out after my freshman year to help launch another software company and doing a lot of work around the back-end engineering and architecture there. That in particular was really formative of I got to be in the room as a company was getting launched in those earliest phases. And while I wasn't making the technical decisions myself about how that underlying infrastructure should have been built, I got to see it happen firsthand and finding folks who are willing to put their faith in you and let you make decisions that you might not otherwise be qualified to make. I feel like that's really where that happened for me. I'm incredibly grateful to Jonathan Marks, who is the CTO at Quorum, was my first boss there, who really put his faith in me and let me make a lot of calls that I wasn't really ready for. But I did it anyway. And I got to help him build out the engineering team there. And it's something I will always remember as a key point in my career. So I spent some time at Quorum, then I went back to school and finished up there, still with this interest in software. I, at the moment, for better or for worse, have a bit of a physical addiction to writing code. So I can't go too long without staring at a terminal or VS Code. And I think that's probably going to last for a while. And then in that was really looking to get back to that experience I had at Quorum, but hopefully with the agency to make some of the calls that I saw Jonathan make. And so then when Jake, who was the CEO here, reached out to me and we started chatting, it felt like this incredible moment to really take that next step. So I've been here at Column as the CTO really from the earliest stages, have done that full transition from being just an individual contributor, just really looking at the code base, to now running a larger team and having a lot of external meetings. The biggest shift I've noticed, at least for myself, that was not incredibly easy for me, I will say, was moving from being individually outcome oriented towards being outcome oriented as a group. I think when you're writing code, it's pretty easy to see a through line between the number of hours you sit at your computer and what pops out the other end. It's not always a perfect line, but it is easier to see. Whereas if instead you're being measured by the outcomes of a larger team, it's harder. And the question is not just how many hours can you spend in front of the computer screen banging away at your keyboard. There's so much more that goes into it. Something that I try to work on and get better at is how can I more effectively scale a team, grow a team, and put them in a position to succeed.
So based on the lessons you've learned, what advice would you give to others who are currently engineers, but they're stepping into leadership positions at startups?
One piece of advice I would give is, as a leader in an engineering organization, I think one of the most impactful skills that you can develop is effectively communicating externally, being able to really synthesize and understand the relative difficulty of implementation paths within your product and communicate that to someone who is sitting at the other end of the table is a bit of a superpower. I think it's pretty hard to always do unless you really do have that kind of deeper in the weeds understanding of what's happening within the code base. And so I think flexing that muscle and working on communication just broadly with folks who do not have direct insight into your code base is one. Also, I would say definitely try to find people in your life external to the company who you can talk with on a regular basis who have been through some of the challenges that you're going through now. I think one of the things that I've appreciated recently is that none of the things that I'm working on right now are currently never seen before by a person in terms of my role as an engineering leader, realizing that the problems we are facing are certainly not insurmountable and are certainly things that almost everyone has gone through once they've stepped into fill this role has been pretty comforting for me, especially when there's a hard day of feeling, how on earth am I going to figure out this particular problem that's in front of me?
Awesome. Really helpful. So another question that we wanted to ask you about based on your experience working in the startup world is that working at different stage startups can be very different depending on where they're at along their process of growth. With that in mind, and knowing that you have had your career predominantly on the engineering side of things, what would you give to engineers of the benefits and downsides of diving in at those different stages along the way?
Generally, at startups, everything is being done the worst it will ever be done in the history of the company. And again, not because people are bad or don't know what they're doing or aren't trying, it's just because it's being done for the first time. And so I think when you look at a startup and you start working on an engineering team, there's a pretty clear correlation from my perspective with how early that company is and just how much room for improvement there is around that code base, the tooling, the infrastructure in place to do work. Everything is just at its infancy. And so I think if you start looking at a company that's maybe 5, 6 people on this engineering team, it's going to be a markedly different experience than a startup that is 50, 60 plus on the engineering side. When you're in those really early phases, so much is focused around this conception of, hey, can I get something out the door to get real customer engagement and real customer feedback to prove that this company should exist? And frequently in that context, things that are certainly good in the longer arc to build a scalable team don't get done yet. There likely would not be as much tooling around a build pipeline to help a new person onboard. There likely would not be as much formal structure around the cadence of work. Those things likely just don't exist when you're at that small stage. But the fun thing is you get to build them. That to me is why I really enjoy this process of simultaneously nothing exists and you have the opportunity to create it. That being said, it is very helpful to be at a larger organization in which you see things being done well. It's really easy when you're making calls, as I've done a couple times early in my career, to make the wrong call, right? Like you are certainly in an early stage environment, figuring things out as you go. And I would say learning things the hard way. Whereas in a later, more formalized company, you have the opportunity to learn from the mistakes that other members of the team have made. And so I think the real spectrum here is this combination of agency on the one end for decision making, paired against the maturity of the organization and the ability to learn from best practice. For me, that is this fundamental trade-off. The earlier you go, likely the more agency you're going to have, but the less structure there's going to be and less support around the decision-making process that you're going through.
So that brings up a relevant conversation that a lot of folks in the Hatchpad community have been discussing recently. And it's the idea of how do you get the resources you need in order to still have that successful career, particularly if you are at the smaller startup with less structure, less ability to meet a mentor in the technical world. What sorts of resources would you recommend to folks who maybe do choose the smaller, earlier stage company to work at?
Yeah. One thing that is worth highlighting is that while there isn't necessarily that formalization in place around mentorship, I do think it's important to go to a company where people actually care about your success and care about your success as an individual within an organization. And that is not the default. I think I am so grateful to trust that was given to me early on in previous jobs to make calls that honestly I shouldn't have made given my experience level and make pretty meaningful mistakes that had an impact on production that I learned from. While it certainly at the time, it probably caused the CTO to pull his hair out. I am so appreciative of the fact that he let me do that because I think for my career, it was so unbelievably helpful. So I think while you won't necessarily find a formal mentorship program with 3 levels of people you can go to, finding a place where you believe that the people you're working with care about you as an individual and care about your success matters. The second thing I would say is having mentors outside of the company you work at is so helpful for me. People who have context about your life, context about the company, and importantly, are just really on your side is really, really important. And so what I would say is trying to find people who have done what you've done or have been in the role that you have just a couple of years ahead that you can have that personal connection with has been really transformative for me. And I would really suggest that to anyone. Also, a big thing in that is if you only speak to people when you have an acute crisis, they will not have the context of what's been going on in your life or what's been going on in the organization to actually be helpful, is something I found as well. So it's important to talk to people and reach out to people and engage with people, not just when there's this immediate acute need, but over a longer arc, because I think doing so also just is a nice thing for a relationship between 2 people. It also means that if you do have this pedal to the metal moment, someone will understand the things that have led to it and kind of where your headspace is.